Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual training session today focused on enhancing mission-critical decision-making by understanding core information requirements. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's virtual training session. So provided here is just a quick agenda of what we plan to cover. We'll include a welcome and some background, an overview of today's training, and then we'll move into going through a common framework for defining core information requirements. And then we'll move into a follow-on section specifically focused on core information requirements for the flood-related hazard from a national perspective. Then we will have some time to take a few questions and provide some answers. And just as a couple of reminders, today's session is being recorded, and the recording as well as the materials from today's session will be posted to our website within a couple of days, and participants will be notified as soon as we have that posting available. Additionally, all questions will be taken through the questions and answer feature in WebEx. For those who may be new to our organization, I wanted to provide a quick background about the National Alliance for Public Safety GIS Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We were established about 12 years ago in 2005. We currently have a national member network of about 23,000 public safety officials, operators, as well as the GIS staff that support them, ranging from across all the different disciplines: law enforcement, fire service, EMS, 911 dispatch, public health, et cetera. And fundamentally, our vision is to provide resources and support and the support necessary to equip first responders and leaders with knowledge and skills to apply decision support technology and data. Provided here is just a map to give you some perspective in terms of where our national member network comes from. And you can see here we're distributed across the country, and certainly across all the major population hubs, as well as different areas that are more rural and suburban. So the purpose of today's virtual training and the objectives. The purpose is to gain awareness level knowledge on the process and a national baseline for defining core information requirements to support mission-critical decision-making. And provided here are some of those objectives in terms of what we're going to cover today. So you'll learn about a common framework for developing your agency's core information requirements for the unique set of threats and hazards that you deal with in your communities and in your jurisdictions. Well, in starting to look at that from the lens of routine day-to-day incidents as well as large-scale disasters. Additionally, we'll gain insights on national core information requirements for mutual aid that have been developed and are intended to be consistent across all threats and hazards. We'll learn about specific flood core information requirements and the information NAPSG has gleaned on that issue through our work over the past year. You'll develop some strategies for communicating your information needs as decision makers and operators to your GIS staff and technologists so that they can provide you with the most effective decision support tools and solutions. And we'll give you some insight in terms of how you can contribute feedback and ideas and contribute to that broader thought leadership as NAPSG Foundation and the community works on refining and building out core information requirements for mutual aid as well as incident-specific requirements. So instructors today will include myself, Rebecca Harnett. I'm the Director of National and Federal with NAPSG Foundation, as well as Carla Boyce, the director, another director with us at NAPSG Foundation, who will cover specifically the flood area. So now we'll move into the next section, which is going to be focused around the common framework for defining core information requirements. I want to provide you with some background on this issue, just in terms of the work that we've done to be able to develop and understand this over essentially the past year and a half. We've begun working with the stakeholders in this area starting back about May of 2016, a little bit earlier, And we really looked at it kind of across the community, across disciplines, and across all the different threats and hazards from the lens of mutual aid specifically. We carried out a variety of different exercises and developed after-action reports and after-action plans coming out of those different areas. And we did some different assessments of existing bodies of work dealing with common operational data, essential elements of information, or EEIs, and things like that that you may have heard of. So what it came down to was this basic framework that we started with. And I'm just going to talk through this a little bit. So you see up here, you've got certainly decision makers and operators. And what's important to consider in this lens is that information requirements are needed to be had by decision makers and operators fundamentally. They're the ones that need to make the decisions when it matters most in an event and even in the preparedness for an event. So it's the who and the role that those different decision makers and operators play. When do they need to make those decisions? Obviously, what those decisions are, and then at what frequency do they need to revisit and reassess information to drive related decisions. And that helps us to define what information does a decision maker need in order to address those different decision points we covered here. And that is the information that you need in order to understand what data, even at the attribute and metadata level, are needed to fill those information needs and then use to support those decision points. I share this framework with you because one thing that we observed in the work that's been done so far is a lot of it starts down here at the bottom. It looks first at data and EEIs, but it doesn't start at this point of what are the decisions, who's making those decisions, when are they made, and at what frequency, because this ultimately needs to drive what are your EEIs, or essential elements of information and common operational data. So this helps us to drive out what are those data sets that you need, how do you not create a fire hose of information or put information overload into those decision support tools that GIS staff help to produce for decision makers. So a high-level framework for you to use to help guide that perspective or paradigm. So let's start by talking a little bit about core information requirements for mutual aid. The fundamental question we asked is, what information do you need as a decision maker for effective decision making in an event requiring mutual aid? Now, this spans across all types of mutual aid. It can be routine automatic aid that you run day to day in your agencies. It can also be larger scale mutual aid for intrastate across county boundaries, and in some cases and across state boundaries with different response partners across different agencies. So it really kind of runs that full gamut of mutual aid. And we came down to two areas through our work with local and state stakeholders from across the nation. And it came down to two areas, situational awareness information and resource information. And we define each of these a little bit differently. It was situational awareness information being about those information requirements necessary for general decision making throughout the life cycle of an event or an incident. And then resource information coming down to the information requirements about resources or capabilities that may be requested or offered during an event requiring mutual aid. And our definition for resource information really is derived from the NIMS, or the National Incident Management System, which considers resources to be a combination of personnel, equipment, commodity, et cetera. And it can also include teams and task forces. But what's more important when we look at core information requirements for mutual aid is it's not just about what information, but it's also defining time-bound information requirements. So prior to determining EEIs at a data and even at an attribute level, you need to know when is certain information needed, at what point within those operational cycles are these different pieces of information important to fill those requirements to inform decision making. So provided here is just a flow of how we've taken that area of situational awareness requirements. That really comes down to driving and informing operational decisions that both decision makers as well as operators at the field level need to make. And it comes down to these 4 key buckets: event scale, event forecast, demographic trends, and critical information. When we looked at the historic body of work around CODS, or Common Operational Data, and EEIs, essential elements of information, what we noticed was, since it was looking so much at that granular level, nearly all of that information was falling under this bucket of critical information, critical infrastructure information, excuse me. But really, there's a lot of other information around situational awareness across these other buckets that needs to be included and supported at those different time-bound points. So what we've done here is we're providing kind of what do we mean by each of these things? What do we mean when we say event scale, event forecast, magnitude, demographic trends, critical infrastructure? And we work to break this out in a little bit more definition and also include some of those time thresholds for when some of this information is fundamental to inform decision-making during events. And the other thing that's important is that you may have heard about some of these things before, such as event forecast. You may have an answer for that, but we tried to build that out a little bit more because it's not just about kind of the forecast of, say, you know, we think this hurricane is getting stronger, but looking at it from a deeper level of forecasting things like cascading consequences. What are some of the other severe weather activity that may result from this type of a hurricane, et cetera? And I think that certainly applies to it in terms of how we look at things like demographic trends. We can't just look as simply as, okay, what is the basic population breakdown based on age and the number of households, but digging deeper and looking at actual trends around things like primary language spoken, socioeconomic brackets, different social vulnerability components, populations with access and functional needs, and transportation dependencies. It's those types of more detailed demographic information that's really necessary to drive decision-making during a major event, and as an incident scales from simple to complex. And certainly critical infrastructure, there is obviously key situational awareness that is had through critical infrastructure information. But again, this is kind of where it digs deeper into looking at, you know, what is the most important and by which different decision makers. And this can vary greatly by emergency support functions, or ESFs, and it can also vary just based on your discipline. Are you police versus fire versus health, just as an example. And we'll dig into this a little bit more. So this is where we took that perspective from our overarching framework here and tried to dig down into each of those buckets a little bit more into understanding what do we mean by some of these things. This is in no means all-encompassing, but it does provide you with a little bit more of an example of what are some of those CODS and EEI information. And bearing in mind, in many cases, it's not something as simple as, great, where are the hospitals, but also about what's the status of those hospitals. Are they open? Are they closed? What's the bed availability? What's the capacity of their intensive care units? Same thing would apply with things like pharmacies. Are they able to distribute medications, police stations, the status, et cetera? And our guidance is, you know, kind of repeating and tailoring that view for situational awareness based on ESF, or in some cases infrastructure category, because you do need to be careful not to run the risk of overloading your decision makers with too much information, but really driving out what types of infrastructure information do they need to know to inform decision making. And kind of that same thing applies on demographics. What types of information do they need to know in order to prepare for and request the right type of, say, mass care services, be it sheltering or feeding or patient relocation in some instances. Great. So here is, we're going to move a little bit now into kind of resource information. And resources, I'm referring to things like emergency response resources, anything that would be relied upon to support an event at any scale. So provided here are kind of the key information that's needed about resources and the sharing of that information to drive decision-making, to be able to plan and allocate and request resources effectively during an event. So it starts with capability. What do you need it to do, right? So it's not just the thing or the what. It's not just about I need a fire truck or I need a search and rescue team, but what do you actually need it to accomplish? What is that capability? The size, in some cases, descriptor. What's the physical size or capacity of that resource? Amount. How many of those types of equipment or how many of those types of personnel do you need to be able to support your response? What's the location where you're going to need that resource to potentially be delivered? And then in some cases where there already is say a NIMS typing definition or a position qualification sheet, that would help to define that minimum set of requirements of what that resource is. And then the other key element is obviously time. When do you need it and for how long do you need it? And the stakeholders that we've worked with have also kind of defined some general framework here around the time thresholds for different types and levels of mutual aid. So intrastate mutual aid is generally able to cover an event over that initial 12-hour operating period. And then if an event continues to persist or it increases in scale or complexity, kind of beyond that 24-hour point is typically where mutual aid is called in by neighboring states under those individual state-to-state agreements for mutual aid. And then obviously national mutual aid is generally requested for events either forecasted or predicted to be 48 hours or more in duration or that result in an extended response time as well. And that's really where things like EMAC come into play once a governor has declared a state of emergency in the state where the event is taking place. So what we have here is a very similar kind of requirements flow for resource management related decision making and understanding the information needs and then the types of data down at the attribute level that help to inform that decision-making process by, be it emergency managers, fire chiefs, incident commanders, et cetera. So you can see how those different elements break down. So it comes down to that resource capability and capacity, the availability of that resource, the deployment time, and the resource cost, as well as its readiness. And you can see the kind of more that data or attribute level information that's necessary in order to fill those information needs and flow up to informed decision making. Similar to how we shared with situational awareness information, provided here is a breakdown of resource information requirements for these different areas. And again, what we've attempted to do where applicable indicate when this information is needed on those time-bound points. So you can see resource kind and type. Stakeholders had indicated that this is the most critical information point resource requesters need to know when assessing if a resource can fulfill the necessary capability. This certainly came up in recent events when we spoke with various practitioners in the field that were requesting, as well as those deploying into the recent series of hurricanes in particular. One thing that's important to note here is ensuring that that resource kind and type information is consistent with NIMS resource typing definitions when and where they exist. So FEMA has something called the Resource Typing Library Tool where you can go in and access that information. Now, it's important to note that FEMA does not issue resource typing definitions for all types of resources or positions, There's certainly a work in progress and a great body of existing definitions there to start from. Then it moves down into the next most important thing is the responsive availability of a given resource. And this really helps to relate to determining if a resource is fully available now and what type or level of mutual aid. And then obviously the deployment time, how long or how fast until a resource arrives at the staging area and can be employed in the operations. And obviously resource cost and identification of responsible party with fiscal obligation to pay for the resource is a key information point, as well as its status and readiness to deploy. So what I'm going to share with you now is how some of this information can get rolled up in pieces of this information, both from situational awareness as well as some of the resource management information into the tools that can support decision makers. And what I'm sharing with you today is actually a guidance tool that NAPSG has in development. It's not yet final. We actually have it out for comment to a number of local and state stakeholders. And we intend to be able to release this publicly within the next 2 to 3 weeks, and we will be notifying everyone once it is released. But I wanted to share this with you as a way to frame how you pull in situational awareness and some resource management information into a type of decision support tool called, in this case, a dashboard or a resource management dashboard. So this is a guidance. It's an interactive web-based guidance tool. It gives you an idea of who are the stakeholders and where are they from that have contributed to this effort, as well as some of these key terms that we referred to today. It then breaks down into what are the types of decision support tools that you would bring in some of that situational awareness as well as resource information to help fill decision maker needs and requirements. Many of you are probably familiar with things like a common operating picture, but really what we're seeing is a move from the COP or the viewer into a dashboard with real-time visual depiction and key metrics. And these metrics really help to drive that decision-making. They provide the analysis up front. And there's some additional guidance here as to what do we mean by using technology for incident level, in this case, resource management and decision-making. And what are that breakdown? Who needs to know what, when, by who? We break down that kind of decision-making pathway and the decision-making process so we can understand, and again, this aligns to a lot of what we talked about thus far in today's training with regards to data at the attribute level flowing up to inform decision-making. And here we have just an example of what a resource management dashboard looks like that provides a combination of situational awareness information. You can see this one is a basic dashboard used to support search and rescue decision-making. And you can see here it provides that real-time analysis on the status of resources. In this case, those status of resources are the actual search and rescue workers. So it gives that lens into across this area of interest, you know, that amount that are working versus not working. It also gives you an idea of the status of different mission operations by U.S. national grid areas. Cleared of star requests are the ones in green. The ones in orange and red are areas in need or underway of search and rescue. You can see how different elements of situational awareness information help to drive decision making. And then it does include some of the critical infrastructure, so you can see some of the fueling stations. So for search and rescue in a large area or a wide area SAR, this would be particularly important so that incident commanders can send their workers and their teams to fueling stations that are open, right, the green ones versus red being closed. Just an example there. Again, here we try to break down information requirements and supporting analytics for resource information and mission information and how that drives basic decision support analysis. Another important point to consider when looking at core operational information requirements is defining those metrics with your decision makers, or if you are the decision makers, how do you want to be measuring progress towards meeting your operational goals? Now, this example I'm sharing with you here gives an example from the lens of mass care and specifically sheltering. So in this case, they had a planning factor in an earthquake scenario of needing to be able to shelter a population of 400,000. In terms of their progress towards meeting that need of the number of shelters available, but also the capacity of those shelters, they're able to see that as shelters turn on and their beds become available, this gauge would automatically change based on the status of that information. So it's an example of how you set the metric of what your planning factor is, or in this case, what you know to be your population needing sheltering, and how you can track and manage that. And this gives you another way to visualize as a decision maker in this instance, open, full, and closed shelters in actual numbers. So you're not having to go one by one on the map to determine this, but you've got these key information points to help inform your decision making so you know what resources you need to request and seek out. And here we provide some basic guidance on how to get started in defining those different information needs to drive decision-making so that you can build the appropriate solutions using whatever technology solution and platform that you may use in that process. And this particular guidance does include a model live resource management dashboard. This particular model is still in development. It does take a couple moments to load, and you'll see this getting refined over the next couple of weeks, but it does provide a step-by-step way to engage with a draft and model dashboard that would be used by decision makers in this field. And with that, I'm going to actually move back into our slide deck today. Again, this is a link to this draft guidance. Again, I'll caveat that this is a draft, and we will move forward. Great, and with that, I will hand it over to Carla Boyce, who will cover the National Flood Core Information Requirements. Carla, over to you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. You'll find as we talk through some flood incident-specific topics that much of what Rebecca has already talked about today is as relevant in flood or no-notice or rapidly unfolding events. Excuse me. Just to bring to your attention, the National Flood Preparedness Guideline was released in June 2017 and is available on our website, and you'll be able to access the link below from this slide presentation. I want to talk about three things specifically as we round out the presentation today. Changing outcomes by getting actionable information to the right person at the right time, and Rebecca did a fantastic job in showing some resource management dashboards, or dashboards if you will. They can do far more than just manage your resources and give you situational awareness. Also want to talk a little bit about building trust and confidence in the data and those dashboards so that decision makers and operators who encounter them are better able to rely on them. And I just want to round out a little bit with identifying and employing and managing those resources specific to flood events. So first, let's chat a little bit about actionable information and changing outcomes. I'm sure many of you on the phone, if not all of you, are no stranger to information delays, particularly those like flash flood events, those that are no notice or rapidly unfolding, often put lives at risk. Making sure that we can increase the speed at which credible and actionable information gets into the hands of those who need it is vital to saving those lives. There's a couple of ways that we can go about making sure that we increase the speed as well as the credibility of that information. Predictive modeling, for instance, many of you might be familiar with HAZUS, which is a free GIS tool available to you for download. it specifically takes a look at flood events as well as hurricanes and earthquakes. And it helps to promote an understanding of the risk and potential consequences from any number of scenarios that you might be able to put into it. And it supports identifying the likely resources and mutual aid thresholds that a community might have. So by using HAZUS or the National Water Model, you're able to take a look at your community-specific concerns, your greatest risks around flood, and then take a look at how that would affect your community specifically, and then follow the planning and preparedness processes that you have in place in order to build resilience and know what you might need to do should you have a flood event. Integrated sensors are another way to fast-track getting actionable information into the hands of decision makers and operators. Those sensors can be technology-based as well as social media-based. I would suggest that you consider partnering with the USGS or NOAA or others to enhance your local sensor network, and maybe even take a look at exploring some emerging low-cost sensor technology to supplement or grow any existing sensor networks that you have. We'll see in a couple of moments that several communities around the nation have used sensors in order to trigger action to change outcomes for those who might be affected by a flood incident. Just a little bit more about social media. Our recent events across the nation, Harvey, Irma, as well as Maria in Puerto Rico, saw the emergence of social media being accessed by decision makers and operators, and then married up with more trusted information that they could verify so that they could pinpoint their resources and actions and get an idea of what people affected by those disasters needed. We saw this in search and rescue efforts and then subsequent into recovery and mass care efforts as well. It's important to note that identifying and documenting and training and even exercising triggers to drive action is essential to make sure those in your community who are responsible for responding, and even individuals and families themselves, if you train to those triggers and exercise those triggers, they're much more likely to take life-saving action in a timely manner. Pre-planned information as well, the HAZUS models and the national water models, and integrating information from whatever sensor networks you might have. Practicing using social media as well, help you to deploy your dashboards or other pre-planned information hubs even, so that you can make decisions faster and have information at your fingertips. Diving a little deeper into predictive modeling, specifically HAZUS. HAZUS comes with nationally aggregated data. It also has the ability to take in your local data. When working with partners across the nation, we find that being able to integrate local data often gives you better answers for your specific location. And though nationally aggregated data has matured over the past 5 to 10 years, you really can't beat the local data that you have. Data that is managed by folks who need it or who are required to maintain it is simply just more accurate and more relevant. Not to discount nationally aggregated data. In the absence of any data, that's certainly better than nothing at all. The HAZUS model has specific return intervals for floods. You're able to take a look at quick look assessments as well, so you can evaluate potential flooding from specific flood depths at specific locations in your community. You're also able to run scenarios through HAZUS. This is particularly interesting because you're able to run scenarios that account for any mitigation measures your community might have put in place. So you can see what the consequences might be prior to a mitigation effort and what you could expect them to be after a mitigation effort. HAZUS also allows you to take a look at loss estimation, both from a hazard flood loss analysis as well as an economic loss from the results of a particular flood. This provides a much more holistic approach to communities as they look not only at what we might need to do in the response to, but also in the recovery from a flood event, be it a flash flood event or a riverine flood event. The next one we're going to talk about is the National Water Model. It's been recently released and was pressed into service not only during a recent exercise over the spring, but in a real-world event for Harvey. That flood forecasting tool analyzes data from over 8,000 USGS gauges across the country. We've provided the web link there for you if you want to get some more information on gauges in your region. The National Water Model can simulate conditions for more than 2.7 million river reaches across the country's river network. This creates a forecast for the entire network every hour. Previously, NOAA was only able to predict conditions for approximately 4,000 locations. So as you can see, they've nearly doubled the capacity of their water model. The water model is particularly important to emergency managers because they can use this information to better prepare for and respond to flood events. So similar to HAZUS, these models are available both in the preparedness efforts that might be going on in your community, as well as any response and recovery efforts that you might find yourselves in need of delivering. The data from the National Water Model can be used across the nation to monitor potential short-range as well as long-range flood event forecasts, and this is another evolution of flood modeling. Flood modeling was time-consuming previously, and it was quite difficult to get short-range estimations and predictions for flood events. And NOAA has done a tremendous job at evolving their water modeling capabilities in order to provide targeted stream forecasting that supports more actionable decisions at the local level. A little bit more about sensors. Sensors like river gauges, cameras, and even social media can supplement your GIS efforts. I suspect many of you on the phone have explored those or had some success in putting information from your sensor networks into your GIS. This is particularly helpful for flash flood events when getting information to decision makers and operators quickly is essential to changing outcomes for those who might be affected. Sensors, if you identify the triggers and you build the trust in the data and the sensors, then decision makers don't need to wait for the subsequent ground truthing. They get the information through a dashboard or whatever other means you might employ in your community in near real time. In order to build that trust, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a slide or two, managing and maintaining, even enhancing your sensor network and linking that information to GIS builds situational awareness, and obviously making sure that your sensor networks are well maintained is critical to making sure that we strengthen data-driven decision-making. Sensors and networks are key components for those triggers. We have a couple of examples coming up in communities that have documented and have made great efforts to train and exercise to those triggers so that reacting to quickly moving events like a flood, or in particular a flash flood, is a little more like walking and breathing. Innovations in sensor technology are ongoing, especially smaller and lower cost sensors. So if you haven't looked at sensor technology in a while, I would encourage you to do so. A lot has changed and driven costs down. DHS and S&T First Responders Group has partnered with LCRA to perform research and development to build out sensor systems that can monitor and evaluate especially rapidly rising floodwaters. So I mentioned a couple of minutes ago some spotlights. The city of Boulder and the city of Austin have taken great care to document trigger points as well as the sensor information where they can determine whether those trigger points have been reached. So for instance, river gauges, and at what level can they expect undesirable consequences to the populations living in those areas. Between the sensor data and some good old-fashioned institutional knowledge, they were able to document those trigger points and then put in procedures that they could take rapid action on. The City of Austin has done very similar documentation of their trigger points, and if you visit the National Flood Preparedness Guideline, you'll see links to both of those spotlights in that document as well for further information. I mentioned very briefly a couple slides back information hubs and pre-planned products. This was a finding that came out of the work last year in building out the National Flood Preparedness Guideline, and it was put into practice by DHS, S&T, FEMA, and other federal agencies in partnership with a broad number of local and state agencies as well, put together an information hub for Harvey as well as Irma and eventually Maria. And being able to put the data and the products from that data, the analysis, if you will, the value-added analysis in one place for everyone to locate during an incident was invaluable to building not just a common operational picture, but a shared understanding of what was going on in those affected areas, as well as what might be needed to change outcomes for survivors and their communities. Again, these spotlights are in the guideline, and if you visit the website and download that guideline, you'll be able to visit the links that are provided there for additional information. The building trust and confidence in the data, I can't overstate this enough. In working with communities across the nation, particularly operators and decision makers, if they're not familiar with the products that can be available to them and how that information is gathered, and they don't train to it and use it in exercises and in fact as day-to-day as possible, they tend to have a little less trust and confidence in that data, and they go back to old school ways. I'm guilty of that myself from time to time. But I would suggest that reviewing historical information, such as your after-action reports and post-incident analysis as well, with an eye towards data and analytical needs, especially including your GIS software and staff in these efforts, will help you identify operator and decision maker data needs, essential requirements before an incident even happens. And then providing that metadata as well. Often when we look at data, if we don't know where it came from and can confirm that it was a trusted agent and that it's recent data and it's fresh and valuable, then it can either be misused or discounted. Communicating critical information using natural language as well. I find in working with technologists across the country that they speak in their own language, which was great. But if an operator and a decision maker doesn't speak that same language, the opportunities often get lost in translation. Also using a common location reference to reduce confusion. This is especially important in multi-jurisdictional and cross-discipline environments, like we have seen certainly recently in our 3 major hurricanes, and would suggest, as we've found from our constituency across the nation, to adopt and implement a common location language like the U.S. National Grid. Additional information about the U.S. National Grid is available on the NAPSG Foundation website as well. And just a reminder that the USNG is both a point and an area reference system. And the beauty of the reference part of the USNG is that it allows you to take a look at a potentially affected area in a very quantifiable way that can help drive actionable, risk-driven decision making. Consider creating some mission-focused applications. Rebecca has talked about dashboards, and we've talked about them again in this last block of training. There's a tremendous amount of information, so trying to find ways to target that information and sift through the white noise is incredibly helpful to decision makers and operators so that they can focus on their piece of the mission, whether it's mass care or search and rescue or stabilizing community lifelines like energy and water and communication, can be very helpful. It's not that the information isn't related to each other, but providing it in a mission-focused, targeted manner helps them shape their decision based on the function or task that they have at hand. Using standard symbology also brings clarity and common understanding. There's some incident symbology guidance and a symbol set on the NAPSG Foundation website as well, and the URL is there for your reference. And include the use of location-enabled decision support tools in your exercises. I have found at the local, state, and national level that if we don't incorporate GIS and decision analytics and using location-enabled decision support tools in our exercises and to the extent that we can in our day-to-day operations, again, they tend to get pushed to the side, and we revert to our more familiar acetate and grease pencils or spreadsheets. So putting them in your exercises certainly promotes a familiarity, a trust, and a confidence, and it tests the assumptions that we have about the data as well to make sure that we're collecting the right data with the right rigor and the right depth of detail and getting it into the hands of the right person at the right time to foster data-driven decision-making. I'll wrap up here with just a reminder on identifying, employing, and managing resources. We know that flooding can affect a large geographic area. We've seen this in Harvey and Irma, or certain parts of Irma, certainly in North Florida. Resource management tools like the ones that Rebecca has talked about already with the dashboards can help you estimate in near real time the resource requirements and their availability, and then communicate that between agencies that might be supporting one another. Some key takeaways here with regards to managing resources is implementing NIMS resource management protocols and procedures. Many of you may have already received the NIMS alert that a refreshed NIMS guidance has been published, I believe, last week. There were some focused enhancements to resource management and those protocols, so give that a look when you get an opportunity. Build some mission-ready packages. This is particularly important around those rapidly unfolding events like floods, particularly flash floods, so knowing what you might need ahead of time in your community if you have a multi-jurisdictional or multi-discipline event, a large-scale event, in other words, can help you get those packages en route to you and employed quickly. Employer resource management dashboard similar to the ones that you've seen today, and consider using some freely available tools. Perhaps you've heard of FEMA's IRIS or the resource typing library tool, which Rebecca mentioned earlier. Those resources are available on FEMA's website and should be relatively easy to find. And also consider exploring some systems like the International Association of Fire Chiefs National Mutual Aid Net and EMAC's MAS system. And I believe we have some of those links later on in the presentation. For the national and federal system, FEMA addresses resource management through its NIMS, which was recently updated. That guidance fosters standardization. EMAC, of course, governs the nation's state-to-state mutual aid during a governor-declared state of emergency. EMAC also provides some guidelines and templates for building those mission-ready packages that I just mentioned. That includes some standardized language, tools to help your agency categorize and identify commodities, as well as the personnel and equipment. For more information, there's a host of links provided on this slide for you. Moving forward on the National Flood Preparedness Guideline, we have some next steps. In the winter of 2018, we will be conducting 2 local pilots designed to assist local jurisdictions in enhancing their flood preparedness and operational readiness, promote knowledge transfer and operationalize that flood preparedness guideline that I talked about, as well as some flood preparedness solution sets, and validate and inform updates to the National Flood Preparedness Guideline itself. We expect a revised guideline in late spring of 2018. And for those of you who are interested, please plan to provide your comments and feedback. We'll get that out in late spring for some public comments. and also the outcomes from the 2 pilots that I mentioned will inform revisions to that guideline as well. I believe that's my last slide.
Great,
and,
thank you very much for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, so just another key piece of the takeaway message is just keeping in mind that flow of decisions to information needs to data and attributes down to CODs and EEIs. And this is a really important takeaway, particularly for our GIS practitioners and professionals that are with us today, is remember to start with your decision makers and your operators in terms of driving this information versus starting at the data. I know it's very easy for us that we're so inclined to look at data first, but we really need to start with those decision points. So just a key takeaway there. And then we provided this cheat sheet of the supporting resources and web links that you saw throughout today's virtual training session, just as a quick cheat sheet. I know I got a few questions in the Q&A feature already asking about the links to that resource management dashboard component that I recently shared. I do want to mention that it is draft, but the web link to access that draft guidance tool is provided here, and as well as the National Flood Preparedness Guideline that Carla mentioned. The first version of that is here, bearing in mind that an updated version will be released around June of 2018, and we look forward to your participation in that effort as well. And with that, we have our emails are up here in case you have follow-on questions, but in the meantime, we do have a couple of questions for anyone participating. You can use the question and answer feature in WebEx. So feel free to type in your questions and we will answer them as needed. So one of the questions we have was regards to what software is used to create dashboards and decision support tools like the one that we demonstrated. And I'm going to answer that question 2 different ways. One is there is many different types of technology solutions and platforms and software that you can use that is existing commercial off-the-shelf software. In some cases, there's also some open source software out there to develop decision support dashboards that operators and decision makers can use. Obviously, as technologists or GIS staff, you would need to actually develop and configure those solutions to meet the needs of your decision makers. So the specific examples that we shared, the live version of the dashboard, so this one right here, one quick second. This one right here was developed using an application called Web App Builder specifically, and then the model down here, this one was built using something called Operations Dashboard. So 2 different applications. In this case, we used GIS software-based solutions. In this case, they were built on an Esri platform, because that is a platform that we use to do the types of analysis and data management for those. But I am familiar that there are other solutions out there. There's something called Leaflet and a number of others. It really comes down to understanding your decision makers and the decisions that they need to make really need to drive what solutions you use. Just some points there. We're getting a couple of other questions with regards to the slide deck and the recording from today's session. They will be posted to our website following today's session. They'll be posted live within the next couple of days, and you as participants will receive an email with the link on our website to where that material and the recording are posted. Great, and I believe that this is all of the questions that we have today. I just want to thank everyone very much for your participation. We truly hope you found today's session to be valuable, and we will be conducting at least 1 more virtual training before the end of the year, so keep your eyes out on the NAPSG Foundation website for registration to be opening up on that. And without further ado, Carla, thank you very much for your instruction today, and thank you to everyone for participating. This concludes our virtual training session.